It was a bright morning in the bustling city where people rushed to their jobs. The streets were alive with cars honking and pedestrians weaving through traffic. Michelle Carter, a confident black woman in her late 30s, was driving to her first day on the job as the city's new chief of police. She wore a sharp navy blue blazer over a crisp light blue shirt, and her mind was filled with a mix of excitement and determination. She had worked hard for this moment, a moment that meant breaking barriers and proving that leadership could look different than what people expected. Her car wasn't flashy. It was a simple, practical vehicle she'd been driving for years, and it suited her humble personality. As she drove through unfamiliar streets, she took a deep breath, reflecting on how far she'd come. She knew her new position carried a lot of responsibility, but she was ready to lead by example. Little did she know that her morning was about to take a very unexpected turn. As she approached a quiet stretch of road, she noticed flashing blue and red lights in her rearview mirror. A police cruiser was signaling for her to pull over. Michelle was momentarily puzzled. She checked her speedometer. She wasn't speeding. She hadn't broken any rules as far as she could tell. But as someone who believed in respecting the law, she immediately signaled and pulled her car over to the side of the road. Two officers stepped out of the police car and walked toward her. Both men wore crisp black uniforms and official hats, their faces unreadable but serious. Michelle rolled down her window as one of the officers approached. "Good morning, ma'am. Do you know why we stopped you?" asked Officer Daniels, his tone polite but slightly cautious. "No, officer." "Is there a problem?" Michelle asked calmly, her voice steady and professional. The second officer, Grayson, stood slightly behind Daniels, observing Michelle closely. "We noticed you driving through this area. Are you new around here?" Daniels asked, glancing at her license plate and then at her. There was a subtle tension in the air, as though the officers were trying to figure out who she was and why she was there. Michelle nodded. "Yes, I'm new in town. I just moved here recently for work," she replied with a small smile, hoping to ease the situation. Her calmness seemed to puzzle the officers. Daniels exchanged a quick look with Grayson before asking for her driver's license and registration. Michelle handed them over without hesitation, remaining polite, but she couldn't help but notice the subtle change in their demeanor. Their questions felt probing, as if they were trying to assess whether she belonged in this part of town. "May I ask what kind of work brought you here?" Daniels asked, his tone polite but still guarded. Michelle paused for a moment. She could tell they were making assumptions, though she wasn't surprised. It wasn't the first time she'd been judged by appearances, but instead of revealing her role right away, she decided to wait and see how they handled the situation. "It's a leadership position," she said simply, her expression calm but unreadable. Daniels raised an eyebrow, clearly curious, but still uncertain. "Leadership, huh? Must be an important job," he said, trying to sound casual but not entirely masking his doubt. Grayson shifted uncomfortably. Something about Michelle's composure made them both uneasy, though they couldn't quite figure out why. She wasn't defensive or nervous, qualities they often saw during routine stops. Instead, she seemed almost confident, as if she had nothing to prove. Michelle remained patient, watching their reactions. She had faced situations like this before and knew the importance of staying calm. Inside, she was already thinking about how she would address moments like this as chief. She believed in building trust between officers and the community, and this interaction was a perfect example of why change was needed. As Daniels returned her documents, he asked one more question, his tone still polite but laced with curiosity. "Do you have any other form of identification, ma'am?" At that moment, Michelle decided it was time to end the guessing game. She reached into her bag and pulled out her badge, holding it up so both officers could see it clearly. The polished emblem reflected the morning sunlight, and the words "Chief of Police" were impossible to miss. Daniels froze, his eyes widening in shock. Grayson, who had been standing slightly behind, stepped closer to get a better look. For a moment, neither officer said anything. They were completely caught off guard. "Yes," Michelle said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm the new chief of police. Today is my first day on the job." The silence stretched for a few seconds before Daniel stammered. "Chief Carter, I, ah, I didn't realize." Michelle gave him a small, understanding smile. "It's all right, officer. We all have our assumptions, but it's important to remember to treat everyone with the same respect, no matter who they are." Daniels and Grayson exchanged nervous glances, realizing how their initial assumptions had clouded their judgment. They quickly apologized, their earlier confidence replaced by a mix of embarrassment and newfound respect. Michelle nodded, accepting their apology graciously. "Let's move forward from this. We're all on the same team after all," she said before driving off toward the station, leaving the officers with a lesson they wouldn't forget. After Michelle drove away, the two officers, Daniels and Grayson, stood by their cruiser, still processing what had just happened. Neither of them could shake off the shock. They had just stopped their new chief of police. The thought left them feeling embarrassed, but it also made them reflect on how the encounter unfolded. Daniels, the older of the two, was the first to break the silence. "Well, that was unexpected," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. Grayson, who was newer to the force and a little more outspoken, let out a nervous chuckle. "You can say that again. I mean, she didn't exactly look like what I imagined a police chief to be." Daniels shot him a look, his expression a mix of annoyance and agreement. "Careful, Grayson. That's the kind of thinking that gets us into trouble. She handled it better than we did, though. I'll give her that." Grayson nodded, still replaying the moment when Michelle had calmly pulled out her badge. Her confidence had caught them off guard. "Yeah, she didn't even get mad," he said. "If it were me, I would have been furious." Daniels sighed. "That's what makes her the chief, I guess. She didn't need to raise her voice to make a point." He paused, leaning against the car. "But let's be honest here. We judged her. You know we did. We saw a well-dressed black woman in a basic car, and we jumped to conclusions." Grayson frowned, shifting uncomfortably. He didn't want to admit it, but Daniels was right. They had let their assumptions guide their actions, even if it wasn't intentional. "Do you think she noticed?" he asked. Daniels gave him a pointed look. "Of course she noticed. You saw how calm she was. That wasn't just confidence. That was someone who's been through this kind of thing before. She's used to it." Grayson's face fell. "That's kind of depressing, isn't it? She's the chief, and even she has to deal with that stuff." Daniels didn't respond right away. Instead, he stared at the road where Michelle's car had disappeared moments ago. "Yeah, it is," he said finally. "But maybe that's why she's the right person for the job. If she can handle us, she can handle just about anything." Meanwhile, Michelle continued her drive to the station, her expression calm, but her mind buzzing with thoughts. She wasn't upset. She had dealt with situations like this before, but it did remind her of why she had taken this job in the first place. She wanted to change the way people saw law enforcement, not just within the community but within the department itself. When she finally arrived at the station, she parked her car and took a moment to gather herself. The building was large and imposing, with the city's police logo proudly displayed above the entrance. Officers and staff moved in and out, their faces a mix of curiosity and focus. She could feel the weight of the day ahead, but instead of feeling nervous, she felt ready. As she stepped out of her car, a few officers nearby glanced her way. Most of them didn't recognize her yet, though she could tell they were trying to figure out who she was. She walked confidently toward the entrance, her head held high, her badge clipped securely to her blazer. Inside, the station was bustling with activity. Phones rang, officers typed up reports, and the faint buzz of a radio played in the background. Michelle scanned the room, taking in the energy of her new workplace. She knew this was where she would make her mark. A staff member approached her, a young woman who looked slightly flustered. "Excuse me, ma'am, can I help you?" she asked, glancing curiously at Michelle's professional attire. Michelle smiled warmly. "Yes, I'm here to see the precinct commander," she said. The young woman nodded quickly, gesturing toward an office at the far end of the room. "Right this way," she said, leading Michelle through the busy station. As they walked, Michelle noticed the stares. Officers paused mid-conversation to look at her, their expressions ranging from curiosity to confusion. She could almost hear the unspoken questions. Who is she? Why is she here? But Michelle didn't let it faze her. She had faced tougher rooms than this. When they reached the office, the young staff member knocked lightly before opening the door. Inside was Commander Evans, a tall, stern-looking man with salt and pepper hair. He stood up as they entered, his eyes narrowing slightly as he assessed Michelle. "Commander Evans," Michelle said, extending her hand. "I'm Michelle Carter, your new chief of police." For a brief moment, Evans didn't respond. Then, realizing who she was, he broke into a smile and shook her hand firmly. "Chief Carter, it's a pleasure to meet you." "Welcome to the department," he said, his tone warm but professional. As they exchanged introductions, Michelle could sense the curiosity in his eyes. He, like the officers she had encountered earlier, was probably trying to figure her out. But unlike them, he didn't let it show. Michelle smiled, ready to prove herself not just through her words but through her actions. She wasn't here to fit anyone's expectations. She was here to lead. Michelle stood in Commander Evans' office, her badge glinting in the morning light. The air in the room felt heavier than she expected, but she remained composed, confident in the knowledge that she belonged there. Evans, who had spent decades in the force, was polite but visibly curious about her. She could sense it in his eyes, the unspoken question swirling in his mind. "So, Chief Carter," Evans began, leaning slightly against his desk. "It's not every day we get a new chief, especially someone as accomplished as yourself. I hope your morning went smoothly." Michelle's lips curved into a small smile. She wasn't about to let the morning's incident overshadow her first day, but she decided to be honest. "It was eventful," she said, her tone light. "Let's just say I've already met a couple of officers under unexpected circumstances." Evans raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh, I hope nothing serious." "No," Michelle replied, shaking her head. "Just a routine stop. They didn't know who I was at the time." Evans chuckled, though his expression hinted at concern. "Well, I'm sure that was a surprise for them when they found out." Michelle nodded but didn't elaborate. She wasn't here to dwell on the encounter. Instead, she wanted to focus on the bigger picture, why she was there and what she planned to accomplish. "Commander Evans," she said, her voice firm but friendly, "I'm here because I believe we can make this department stronger. I've seen firsthand how important it is to build trust, both within the force and with the community we serve. That's my priority." Evans nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "That's good to hear, Chief. We've faced some challenges over the years. Low morale, community tensions. Change isn't easy, but it's necessary." Michelle met his gaze, her determination clear. "I understand that, Commander. But I also know that real change starts from the top. It starts with leadership. That's why I'm here." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. A young officer peeked in, looking slightly nervous. "Excuse me, Commander. The team is ready for the introduction," he said. Evans looked at Michelle and gestured toward the door. "Shall we?" Michelle nodded and followed him out of the office. As they walked through the station, she could feel the eyes of the officers on her. Conversations quieted as people noticed her presence. Some whispered to each other, and she could guess what they were saying. "Is that her? She's the new chief. She doesn't look like a chief." Michelle kept her head high, her posture confident. She had spent years breaking stereotypes, and this was no different. Her achievements, not her appearance, had earned her this position. She wasn't here to prove her worth to anyone. She was here to lead. When they reached the meeting room, it was packed. Dozens of officers were seated, their expressions ranging from curiosity to indifference. Michelle stepped to the front of the room alongside Evans, who cleared his throat to get everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Evans began, his voice firm and commanding, "it's my honor to introduce our new Chief of Police, Michelle Carter." The room was silent for a moment as Michelle stepped forward. She could feel the weight of their gazes, but she didn't let it faze her. Instead, she took a deep breath and began to speak. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady but warm. "I won't take up too much of your time, but I wanted to share a few thoughts on my first day here." She paused, scanning the room, making eye contact with as many people as she could. "I know change can be uncomfortable. I know some of you are wondering who I am, why I'm here, and what kind of leader I'll be. That's fair, but I'm not here to make promises I can't keep. I'm here to listen, to learn, and to lead us in a direction that makes us better." A few heads nodded subtly, though most officers remained quiet, their expressions neutral. "I believe in this department," Michelle continued. "I believe in the men and women who serve in it, but I also believe we can do better. We can be better. For ourselves, for each other, and for the community we serve." Her words hung in the air for a moment before she smiled faintly. "And just so you all know, I've already met a couple of your colleagues this morning. Officer Daniels and Officer Grayson stopped me on my way here. They didn't know who I was at the time. And honestly, that's how it should be. It was a good reminder for me, and for them, that we all have work to do when it comes to breaking down assumptions." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the room, easing some of the tension. Daniels and Grayson, seated near the back, shifted uncomfortably but managed sheepish smiles. Michelle ended her introduction with a firm yet optimistic tone. "I'm looking forward to working with all of you. Together, we can build something great. Thank you." The room erupted into polite applause, and as Michelle stepped away from the podium, she knew she had taken the first step in earning their respect. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but she was ready for the challenge. As Michelle walked out of the meeting room, she felt a small sense of relief. The first step had been taken, and while it wasn't perfect, it was enough to set the tone. She could feel the stares and murmurs as she left, but she didn't let them bother her. She knew building trust and respect would take time, and that was fine. Change wasn't supposed to happen overnight. Back in her new office, Michelle sat down behind a large wooden desk that still felt unfamiliar. The room was neat, almost too neat, as if it hadn't been used in a while. There were no personal touches, no pictures, or mementos to make it feel like her space. That would come later. Right now, she had more important things to think about. She glanced at the stack of files on the corner of her desk, each one representing a different issue the department was facing. Low morale, community complaints, outdated policies. It was all there, waiting for her to tackle. But Michelle wasn't the kind of person to rush into things. She knew that if she wanted to make meaningful changes, she had to start by understanding the people she was leading. Just as she was about to dive into the files, there was a knock at her door. "Come in," she said, straightening up in her chair. The door opened, and Officer Daniels stepped in, looking slightly hesitant. Michelle immediately recognized him as one of the officers who had stopped her that morning. He seemed uncomfortable, almost like a student called to the principal's office. "Chief Carter," he began, his voice respectful but unsure. "I just wanted to apologize for earlier today. It wasn't our intention to, judge you or anything." Michelle smiled gently, motioning for him to sit down. "Officer Daniels, I appreciate you coming to speak with me. But let me ask you something. Why do you think you and Officer Grayson reacted the way you did?" Daniels hesitated, his face showing a mix of discomfort and thoughtfulness. "I guess we just weren't expecting someone like you. I mean, not that there's anything wrong with it. It's just different." Michelle nodded, her expression calm. "Different isn't necessarily a bad thing, Daniels, but it does make people uncomfortable sometimes. That's something we all need to work on, not just you, but everyone in this department, including myself." Daniels looked surprised. You, Chief? I mean, you seem like you've got it all together. Michelle chuckled softly. Appearances can be deceiving, Daniels. I've had to work twice as hard to get to where I am. And even now, I still face doubts and assumptions. The important thing is to keep moving forward, to keep proving that you're capable, no matter what others might think. Daniels nodded slowly, clearly taking her words to heart. Thank you, Chief. I'll keep that in mind. As Daniels left the office, Michelle felt a small sense of accomplishment. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Changing the culture of the department would take countless small conversations like this one. But she was ready for it. Later that afternoon, Michelle decided to take a walk around the station. She wanted to get a feel for the place, to see how things operated on a day-to-day basis. As she moved through the hallways, she greeted everyone she passed, making an effort to remember names and faces. Some officers responded warmly, while others seemed more reserved. Michelle understood their hesitation. She was new, and people needed time to adjust. In the break room, she found a small group of officers chatting over coffee. One of them, a woman named Officer Rivera, seemed particularly animated as she talked about a recent case. Michelle approached the group with a friendly smile. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. The officers looked surprised but quickly made space for her. Rivera, who seemed more outgoing than the others, spoke up. "Of course, Chief. We were just talking about a case we closed last week." Michelle listened attentively as Rivera described how the team had worked together to solve a tricky burglary case. It was clear that Rivera was proud of the work they had done, and Michelle made sure to acknowledge that. "That's exactly the kind of teamwork we need more of," she said, her tone encouraging. "It's important to celebrate these wins, no matter how small they might seem. They remind us why we do what we do." The officers nodded, their initial awkwardness beginning to fade. Michelle could see the beginnings of a connection forming. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give her hope. By the time Michelle returned to her office, she felt a little more settled. The station, though still unfamiliar, was starting to feel less daunting. She knew she had a long road ahead, but she also knew she wasn't alone. The department had its challenges, but it also had potential, a lot of it. And Michelle was determined to bring out the best in everyone, one step at a time. As the day drew to a close, Michelle leaned back in her chair, looking out the window at the city skyline. She thought about the officers she had met, the stories they had shared, and the challenges they would face together. Change wasn't easy, but it was possible, and Michelle was ready to lead the way. The next few days at the station were anything but easy for Michelle. Adjusting to her new role as chief wasn't just about managing paperwork or attending meetings. It was about gaining the trust of a team that was still unsure of her. While some officers seemed genuinely curious and eager to give her a chance, others remained distant, their skepticism practically radiating off them. Michelle noticed it in the way some avoided her in the hallways or kept their answers short during briefings. She didn't take it personally. Instead, she saw it as a challenge to overcome. Michelle believed that trust was earned through action, not words. So she made it a point to be present in the day-to-day work of the department. She didn't stay confined to her office. She walked the hallways, visited different departments, and spent time in the dispatch center, where the phones never stopped ringing. She asked questions and listened carefully to the concerns of her team. Slowly, she started to piece together the issues that had been holding the department back. One of the biggest problems Michelle discovered was the growing disconnect between the officers and the community they served. Complaints about police behavior and a lack of trust had been piling up for months. Michelle could feel the weight of these issues every time she stepped out into the city. The community was watching her, just as closely as her officers were. One morning, Michelle decided it was time to address this issue head-on. She called a meeting with the station's senior officers. As they gathered in the conference room, she noticed the mix of expressions on their faces. Some looked curious, while others seemed wary. Commander Evans sat at her side, his expression calm but observant. "Thank you all for being here," Michelle began. her voice steady. "I've spent the past few days getting to know this department, and I've seen a lot of potential. But I've also seen areas where we can improve." She paused, letting her words sink in. The room was silent, all eyes on her. One of the biggest challenges we face is rebuilding trust with the community. I've reviewed the complaints, and I've spoken with some of you about the tensions we're seeing out there. It's clear that we need to do more, not just to enforce the law, but to connect with the people we serve. One of the older officers, Lieutenant Harris, spoke up. His tone was respectful, but cautious. "With all due respect, Chief, we've tried community outreach programs in the past. They don't always work. People still see us as the enemy." Michelle nodded. She appreciated Harris's honesty. "I understand your frustration, Lieutenant, but I believe we've been approaching it the wrong way. Outreach can't just be about showing up to an event once a month and hoping people will suddenly trust us. It has to be consistent. It has to be personal." She glanced around the room, her gaze firm. "That's why I'm implementing a new initiative. Starting next week, every officer will spend one shift per month engaging directly with the community. Whether it's visiting schools, attending neighborhood meetings, or simply walking the beat and talking to residents, I want us to be visible, not as enforcers, but as people." The room buzzed with murmurs. Some officers exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from interest to skepticism. Michelle could feel the resistance, but she wasn't deterred. "This isn't just about improving our image," she continued. "It's about making our jobs easier in the long run. When people trust us, they're more likely to cooperate with us. They're more likely to share information and work with us to keep the community safe. That benefits all of us." Commander Evans nodded in agreement. "The chief is right," he said, his voice carrying authority. "I've seen firsthand how much of a difference trust can make. It's not an easy road, but it's worth it." Michelle ended the meeting by asking for input from the team. She knew that involving them in the planning process would make them more likely to support the initiative. Some officers shared ideas for community events, while others suggested ways to track their progress. By the time the meeting ended, there was a noticeable shift in the room. While not everyone was fully convinced, Michelle had planted the seed of possibility. Later that day, Michelle decided to take her own advice. She left the station and walked through one of the city's busiest neighborhoods. Dressed in her uniform, she greeted shop owners, chatted with parents waiting outside a school, and listened to concerns from residents. At first, some people were hesitant to approach her, but as they saw her genuine interest, they began to open up. A woman named Mrs. Ramirez, who owned a small bakery on the corner, shared her worries about recent break-ins in the area. Michelle promised to look into it, taking detailed notes as they spoke. "It means a lot that you're here, Chief," Mrs. Ramirez said, her voice warm. "We don't usually see someone at your level out here." Michelle smiled. "That's going to change," she said firmly. By the time she returned to the station, Michelle felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, but moments like these reminded her why she had taken the job. It wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about making people feel seen, heard, and protected. Michelle's initiative to rebuild trust between the police and the community started to take shape in the following weeks. She had spent hours planning and working with her officers, ensuring the program was realistic and achievable. While she knew it wouldn't fix everything overnight, she believed it was a step in the right direction. The first community engagement shift happened on a bright Saturday morning. Officers were assigned different neighborhoods to patrol, not with the intent of enforcing rules but to talk to people, listen to their concerns, and simply show that they cared. Michelle made it a point to participate herself. She chose a neighborhood with a mix of small businesses and residential homes, a place where tensions with the police had been high for years. Walking down the busy streets, Michelle could feel the eyes of residents on her. Some looked curious, others cautious, and a few openly skeptical. She stopped outside a small grocery store where the owner, a middle-aged man named Mr. Patel, stood arranging fresh produce on a stand. "Good morning," Michelle said, her tone friendly as she extended her hand. "I'm Chief Carter. Just thought I'd stop by and introduce myself." Mr. Patel looked surprised but shook her hand. "Good morning, Chief. This is unexpected." Michelle smiled. "I imagine it is, but I'm hoping it won't be for long. I'm trying to get to know the community better, and I'd love to hear any concerns you might have." At first, Mr. Patel hesitated, as though weighing whether or not to speak openly. Finally, he said, "Well, there's been a rise in shoplifting lately. It's mostly small things, but it's starting to add up. I've called the station a few times, but nothing seems to happen." Michelle nodded, taking out a small notebook. "I'm sorry you felt unheard, Mr. Patel. That's something we need to work on. I'll make sure someone follows up on this, and if there's anything else you think we can do better, please don't hesitate to let me know." By the time their conversation ended, Mr. Patel looked more at ease. "Thank you for taking the time to listen, Chief. It means a lot." This was what Michelle had envisioned, small but meaningful interactions that could slowly rebuild trust. She continued her walk, stopping to chat with a group of teenagers hanging out near a basketball court, an elderly woman tending to her garden, and a young mother pushing a stroller. Each conversation was a chance to show the community that she and her team were there to serve, not just to enforce. Back at the station, the response to the new program was mixed. Some officers embraced the change, reporting positive interactions with residents. Others were less enthusiastic, grumbling about how the extra effort took time away from what they saw as real police work. Michelle knew it would take time to shift this mindset, but she was patient. Change, after all, was rarely comfortable. One afternoon, Michelle called a meeting with the officers participating in the program. She wanted to hear their feedback and address any concerns. As the group gathered in the station's briefing room, she noticed a mix of expressions, some eager, others doubtful. "Thank you all for coming," Michelle began, her tone warm but firm. "I know this initiative is new, and I understand it's a big adjustment for some of you, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. How's it going out there?" Officer Rivera, who had been one of the first to support the program, raised her hand. "I think it's working, Chief. I've had a few residents tell me they appreciate seeing us out there in a different way. It's not just about writing tickets or making arrests anymore. It's about building relationships." Michelle nodded, her expression encouraging. "That's exactly what I was hoping to hear. Anyone else?" Another officer, Sergeant Collins, crossed his arms and spoke up. "With all due respect, Chief, some of us feel like this isn't what we signed up for. We're here to fight crime, not make small talk." Michelle met his gaze evenly. "I understand your perspective, Sergeant, but let me ask you this. How often do you think people cooperate with us when they see us only as enforcers?" Collins hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the question. "Not often, I guess." "Exactly," Michelle said. "Building trust isn't just about making people feel good. It's about making our jobs easier in the long run. When people trust us, they're more likely to report crimes, share information, and work with us to keep their neighborhoods safe. This isn't just a community issue, it's a public safety issue." The room was quiet for a moment as the officers absorbed her words. Slowly, a few began to nod in agreement. Michelle could see that while not everyone was fully convinced, progress was being made. Over the next few weeks, the program continued to grow. Michelle made it a point to highlight success stories during weekly briefings, sharing examples of how community interactions were leading to real results. A resident's tip led to the recovery of stolen property. A local youth center invited officers to speak with teens about career paths. Slowly but surely, the walls between the department and the community began to come down. Michelle knew there was still a long way to go, but she felt a deep sense of purpose. This wasn't just a job to her, it was a mission. And with every step forward, she felt more confident that she and her team were on the right path. Weeks turned into months, and Michelle's vision for the department began to show results. The atmosphere at the station was slowly changing. Officers who had once been skeptical about her community engagement program were now sharing stories of meaningful interactions with residents. Michelle noticed more smiles in the hallways, more collaboration among her team, and even more pride in their work. It wasn't perfect. There were still challenges to face, but the change was undeniable. One sunny morning, Michelle received a call that filled her with mixed emotions. A city council member invited her to speak at a public town hall. The event was meant to address community concerns and provide updates on police reforms. It was an opportunity to share her progress, but Michelle knew it wouldn't be an easy crowd. Many residents still harbored resentment toward the police, and she would need to face tough questions. But she also knew this was her chance to prove that the department was moving in the right direction. The evening of the town hall arrived, and the large auditorium was packed with residents, reporters, and community leaders. Michelle stood backstage, taking a deep breath as she prepared herself. She could hear the murmur of voices from the audience, a mix of anticipation and skepticism. Commander Evans approached her, offering a reassuring smile. "You've got this, Chief," he said. "Just speak from the heart. That's what they need to hear." Michelle nodded, grateful for his support. When her name was announced, she walked onto the stage, her head held high. The applause was polite but hesitant, a reminder of the work still to be done. "Good evening," she began, her voice calm and steady. "Thank you for being here tonight. I'm Chief Michelle Carter, and I'm here to talk about the steps we're taking to rebuild trust between the police and the community." She paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. Some looked open and curious, while others remained guarded. Michelle continued, "When I first took on this role, I knew it wouldn't be easy. I knew there was a lot of pain, a lot of frustration, and a lot of mistrust. And I want you to know, I hear you, I see you, and I'm committed to doing better." Michelle then outlined the changes she had implemented, from the community engagement program to the new training initiatives focused on empathy and de-escalation. She shared real stories of officers connecting with residents and how these efforts were starting to make a difference. "I know this is just the beginning," she said. "Change takes time, but I believe that together we can create a department that truly serves and protects everyone." As she finished her speech, Michelle opened the floor to questions. The first few were cautious, probing whether the changes were genuine or just for show. Michelle answered each one honestly, acknowledging past mistakes and emphasizing her commitment to accountability. Slowly, the tone of the questions shifted. Residents began sharing their own experiences, some positive, some painful, and Michelle listened intently, taking notes and promising follow-ups where needed. Then, a young man in his early 20s stood up. His voice was clear but tinged with emotion. "Chief Carter, I just want to say thank you. A few weeks ago, I had a run-in with one of your officers. Normally, I'd expect them to treat me like a suspect. But this officer, he treated me like a person. He listened to me, and he helped me. That's never happened before. So, thank you for making that possible." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Michelle felt a lump in her throat, but managed a warm smile. "Thank you for sharing that," she said. "It means a lot to hear that we're making a difference. And I promise, we'll keep working to make sure that experience becomes the norm, not the exception." As the town hall came to a close, Michelle felt a mixture of exhaustion and hope. The event had been challenging, but it was also a reminder of why she had taken on this role. She wasn't just leading a department. She was building bridges, one conversation at a time. Back at the station, Michelle gathered her team to share the feedback from the town hall. She made sure to highlight the positive stories while also addressing areas where they still needed to improve. "This is just the beginning," she told them. "We're on the right track, but we can't stop here. Let's keep pushing forward." Months later, Michelle's efforts were recognized on a larger scale. The department received an award for its innovative approach to community policing, and Michelle was invited to share her strategies at a national conference. But what mattered most to her wasn't the accolades. It was the growing sense of trust between her team and the community. One day, as Michelle was leaving the station, she passed by a group of officers chatting in the parking lot. They greeted her warmly, and one of them, Officer Rivera, said, "Chief, you've changed this place. You've changed us. Thank you." Michelle smiled, her heart full. "I didn't do it alone," she replied. "We did this together." As she drove home that evening, Michelle reflected on how far they had come. The road had been filled with challenges, but it had also been incredibly rewarding. She knew there was still work to do, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a deep sense of hope for her team, for the community, and for the future.